Back row.
So this was apparently supposed to be a double act, and the other person, a fracking person, is not here. So we're not going to have fission and fracking, we're going to have fission. But actually we're going to have still two for the price of one, because I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about nuclear power, which was my piece of the old program, but I also want to talk a little bit about the broader problem of energy innovation. And I think that it's useful to remember, to begin with, as we sit here in Boston, that the most important natural resource in addressing the world's energy problem isn't oil, it's not gas in the ground, it's not wind or solar, it's human ingenuity. It's brain power that's going to help us figure out better ways to store, transport, extract, convert, and use energy. Now, of course, we don't just have one energy problem. In fact, we have at least 4 separate problems, each one on its own, very difficult to solve, and because the solutions to one problem will sometimes make the others worse, the overall difficulty is more than additive. In this sense, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The first problem is the rapidly growing need for affordable, reliable energy supplies. By the middle of this century, global energy demand will have increased by at least 50%, and electricity use will have more than doubled, placing great pressure on energy supplies and prices. We're living in a period, and I think we're all aware of this, in which hundreds of millions of people in Asia, South America, and Africa, maybe even billions of people, are lifting themselves out of poverty and starting out on the road to a middle-class standard of living, all within the span of a few decades. This is an economic accomplishment that has no precedent in all of human history, and it's a cause for celebration. One consequence of this, however, is sharply increased energy use. But in case anybody thinks that a doubling of energy or electricity demand by mid-century, which is what the projections indicate, in case anybody thinks that that implies profligate, irresponsible consumption, I point out that that doubling would mean, roughly speaking, that the richest billion of the world's population at that time, in 2050, would be using electricity at about the same rate that the average American uses it today. The middle 7 billion would be using electricity at a rate that the average Chinese is using it today. And the poorest billion would still have no electricity at all. That's what doubling electricity consumption by mid-century would mean, and to me at least, that does not seem profligate. The second problem is that the world's increasing dependence on imported oil and natural gas to meet this demand means economic vulnerability as well as increased international tensions and potential for conflict. There are likely to be significant geopolitical shifts over this period, and we can only speculate about what the possible emergence of US energy self-sufficiency would mean for security arrangements in other parts of the world. But the problem of energy security will remain. The third problem is that coal burning for electricity and for industry and oil burning in vehicles are the main sources of severe urban and regional air pollution, SOx, NOx, hydrocarbons, soot, with severe impacts on public health and acid precipitation. And the fourth problem is that of climate change. How can we meet this rapidly growing demand and need for affordable, reliable energy without wrecking the global climate? I take the view that the problem of climate change and the transition to a low-cost, low-carbon energy system is the most important and urgent problem that we face in the energy sector, as well as the most difficult. But we need to recognize that for much of the next 40 or 50 years, which is the key period for developing an effective response to the climate issue, for much of that period, it's likely that climate will not be the only or even the most important issue on the energy agenda, so that we can't assume a sustained laser-like focus on a policy focus on this issue over this period. And I'm going to come back to that in a little while. In fact, there are some sophisticated analysts who, aware of the enormous scale and the enormous challenges of this low-carbon energy transition, have been refocusing away from the problem of mitigating carbon emissions towards the problem of adaptation. The best of this work is sensible. If the economic and social costs of adapting to the damage caused by climate change are less than the cost of preventing it, then that's a good reason to focus on adaptation. And it's certainly worthwhile to examine what are the most efficient adaptation approaches. For example, in a place like Bangladesh, is it better to invest in building higher dikes or in building more hospitals to treat the very young and the very old sufferers from heat stroke and exhaustion? But the danger of focusing on future adaptation is, of course, that it turns into another excuse for avoiding preventative action today. An excuse for delay, in other words. It now seems likely that we've missed the opportunity to prevent 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. That didn't happen because of a careful, rational calculation that the costs of adapting to this were less than the costs of preventing it. It happened because we were successful in finding excuses for delay. The best approach is the one that John Holdren, the President's science advisor, articulated not long ago when he said, we need enough mitigation to avoid the unmanageable and enough adaptation to manage the unavoidable. The problem with mitigation, of course, is that today most low-carbon energy supply technologies are still too expensive or too difficult to scale or have other environmental or economic drawbacks. This is a chart showing the levelized cost of electricity from alternative means of generating electricity, and the 3 lowest lowest cost options are coal, different coal technologies, and natural gas. And indeed, that chart from 2 years ago is out of date already because, as we know, the price of natural gas has dropped quite a bit since then. And all of the low carbon options are way over on the right-hand side and much more expensive. So, in principle, there are 3 options for dealing with this cost problem. You can mandate or subsidize the deployment of the more expensive new low-carbon technologies. You can make the high-carbon incumbent technologies more expensive through some sort of a tax scheme. Or you can innovate so that the low-carbon technologies become more cost competitive. To oversimplify a little bit, you can either increase the price of the bad things, which in this case means high-carbon fuels, or you can reduce the costs of the good things. For many years, the debate in the United States on this subject has been dominated by the first idea. As the Yale economist Bill Nordhaus put it, to a first approximation, raising the price of carbon is a necessary and sufficient step for tackling global warming. The rest is largely fluff. Now, there's a problem with this, of course. Politically, it hasn't worked for a variety of reasons. One of which is that the price that would be needed to induce innovation at the necessary rate is much too high. And in the end, a carbon price of some kind will be essential. But we also need more direct approaches to accelerate innovation. What Bill Nordhaus refers to here as the fluff. We need more fluff. Now, this is going to be a very big task. And it's useful to think a little bit about how big it's going to be. 4 years ago, when the president was first elected, he and the other leaders of the G8 countries agreed that they should try to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide by 80% by mid-century. Now, he soon stopped talking about this, and for the next 3 years, the whole question of climate change was put on the back burner, at least in the US. Although it would be wrong to say that nothing happened during that period. The new auto emission standards that will result in much higher fleet average miles per gallon by 2025 were a very significant development. But in any case, Mr. Obama has now been re-elected, and climate change seems to be moving back towards the top of his agenda. And so it's worth asking, why did he and the other G8 leaders talk about an 80% reduction in carbon emissions back in 2009, and what would it take to get there? So here's an answer to the first question. Climate modelers estimate that if the atmospheric concentration, and I think you've probably gone over a lot of this already in this semester, if we stabilize at 550 parts per million, roughly twice what the carbon concentration was before the Industrial Revolution began, there's roughly a 50% probability that the global surface average temperature increase will be no greater than 3 degrees C. Now, many people would view that as an insufficient target. A temperature increase of 3 degrees C would be more than 3 times greater than what we have seen over the last few decades because of previous greenhouse gas emissions. And it seems probable that a great deal of damage has already occurred as a result of those. Moreover, as we all recognize, the climate models aren't precise. There are still many uncertainties, and while the mean expectation for 550 parts per million is a 3 degrees C increase, the tail of the probability distribution is long, and there's a significant chance that the actual increase would be a good deal higher. In fact, others, including, of course, the European Union, have set a more stringent target of 2 degrees C, but as I noted, that may now already be out of reach. So for now, let's take the goals of 550 parts per million and 3 degrees C. To stabilize at 550 probably means that the world's emissions by mid-century, 2050, will need to be at least 25% lower than they are today. And since the world's population between now and the year 2050 is expected to increase by about 2 billion, raising up to 9 billion by then, what this means is that the average per capita emissions would need to decline to 0.63 tons of carbon per year by mid-century. 0.63 would be the target. If we further say that all nations, rich and poor alike, should achieve this average level of per capita emissions, a goal which, given that the rich countries have until now been the dominant sources of carbon emissions, many would view as embodying a very minimalist view of global equity, and others wouldn't view it as equitable at all. But let's just take that. It would require the US, which currently emits at a rate of about 5.5 tons of carbon per year per capita, to reduce its overall emissions by about 83% by the year 2050. So that's sort of one way of understanding where that 80% goal came from. By the way, we can do exactly the same calculation for China, which of course on a per capita basis is emitting much less than the US, but which is now the world's largest carbon emitter, and which in combination with the US accounts for more than 40% of total world emissions. To achieve that same per capita 0.63 tons per year goal, China would have to reduce its emissions by about 48%. And here's the first, well, so there you, I'm losing a little bit of my animation with this transition to Windows, never mind. So how difficult would this be? We can gain insight into that from a very simple identity. Now, this is not going to be a talk with a lot of equations. This is probably the only equation that you're going to see. In fact, it isn't even an equation. It's an identity. It's an identity that was first pointed out 20 years ago by the Japanese engineer Yoichi Kaya. And what it says is that the carbon that is emitted by any jurisdiction, a country, a region of a country, a city, a state, the world, that you can express that carbon that is emitted from that jurisdiction in terms of three quantities. The carbon intensity of the economy in that jurisdiction, that's the ratio of carbon divided by the economic output. The productivity of the economy, economic output per unit per capita, and then the population. And so, if the US wants to achieve this 80% reduction in carbon emissions by the year 2050, and if in addition we want to have an economic growth rate of 2% per capita over this period, which by the way is a fairly modest target, it's more than we've been doing over the last decade, where we've achieved something like 1.5% per year per capita, not a great period in the history of our economy. 2 is about what we've done on average since the early 1970s. So take that as a goal, and since the US population is expected to grow a little bit under 1% per year between now and the year 2050, this would require reducing the carbon intensity of the US economy by about 7% each year. This is not something that's up for debate. This is not something that we can interpret, maybe tailor a little bit, shave a little bit. If these are the goals we want, if we want 80% reduction in carbon, and if we want 2% per year per capita growth, then this is what we have to do. 7% per year reduction in our carbon intensity. If we can't do it, we won't achieve those goals. This is just simple arithmetic. This is not something for politicians to debate. It's the fact. If we look back over the last 25 years, we've only managed to achieve a 2% per year reduction in carbon intensity on average. And that gap between 2% and 7% is in some sense, that's a measure of our energy innovation problem. Closing that gap is going to require both an acceleration, a rapid acceleration, of the rate at which our energy supply system is being decarbonized, and a rapid decline in the amount of energy used per unit of economic output. In other words, more energy efficiency. Again, we can go through exactly the same exercise with the Chinese. There, of course, the aspirations for economic growth are a lot higher. The Chinese government has recently been talking about sustaining an economic growth rate of something like 6%. By the way, worryingly low for many people in the Chinese government who would like to see more rapid growth. If, in addition, the Chinese were to set that same goal, per capita goal, which translates into an overall reduction of carbon emissions by 48% by the year 2050, and if, as expected, China's population remains roughly stable and even shrinks a little bit by mid-century, China would need to reduce its carbon intensity by about 7.4% per year on average between now and the year 2050. A little bit more than us. It's worth noting that former Premier Wen Jiabao announced that China would try to achieve a 5.8% per year reduction rate over the next decade. Even though this falls short of what our very simple calculation tells us would be needed, it's actually quite impressive if they're able to do it. Indeed, on this basis, one might even conclude that at least when it comes to what the two countries say they're going to do about greenhouse gas reduction, China's statements may actually be a little more convincing than those of the United States. Of course, it won't be enough for China and the US alone to reduce their carbon emissions. Everybody else is going to have to do it too. But unless China and the US together take decisive action, we can say that severe climate damage will be unavoidable regardless of what the rest of the world does. So how are we going to close this innovation gap from 2% to 7%? One way to think about this is in terms of 3 waves of innovation. The first wave is about improvements in energy efficiency, mainly not through technological advances, but through new business models, new institutions, new ways of delivering energy services. These can be implemented fastest in our economy. This is the first wave. The second wave will overlap with the first, which of course must continue, but especially after the year 2020, we're going to have to see deployment of the major low carbon energy technologies, nuclear, solar, wind, maybe geothermal and low carbon biofuels, and carbon capture and storage on a scale that far exceeds anything that we've seen previously. By the way, there's an implication here which I want to emphasize, which is that the only technologies that have the potential to make a significant impact on carbon emissions at scale by mid-century are the ones that we already know about. We're not going to be bailed out on that time frame by inventions that haven't yet been made or that are still sitting on people's benches. That's because of the time it takes to bring new technologies to commercialization and then to penetrate the market on a substantial scale. We might also hope to see a third wave of innovation, drawing on fundamentally new developments in materials and catalysis and energy transport, and in the best case, overcoming long-standing physical limits on things like energy storage and conversion. We're talking here about things like artificial photosynthesis, air capture of carbon dioxide, maybe even fusion energy. But the long lead times required to translate breakthrough research into commercially viable technologies and then to achieve on top of that significant market penetration means that these kinds of breakthroughs are not likely to be making significant contributions before the year 2050. But the point I want to emphasize here is that we need to be focusing on all of these waves simultaneously and immediately, even though the time for large-scale takeoff is separated by decades. Now there's another way to look at this problem of energy innovation. And that is this very simple 4-stage model of the innovation process, which begins with the discovery and development of new technological possibilities, followed by ascertaining, demonstrating the viability of these options in the marketplace, then followed by cost reduction and other improvements during the initial adoption phase of the innovation in the marketplace. We'll talk about that as sort of early take-up. And then finally, the continued refinement of the innovation in large-scale use, which we'll think of as improvements in use. Accelerating energy innovation, which is what this discussion is about, means accelerating all 4 of these stages of the innovation process. It's not enough to focus on just one. We more or less know what to do at the first stage, the option creation stage. By the way, I should have said, these 4 activities don't really map very well onto the traditional way of thinking about this as basic research, applied research, development, demonstration. I don't really have time to talk about why, but it is important to recognize that this is not what you generally see in these discussions. We know what to do in order to accelerate the early adoption process. We need to rely on a combination of government R&D spending, higher education spending, venture investing, and so on. And we need more of all of those things, but much of the force that more R&D spending might exert at the front end of the process will simply be dissipated unless effective strategies are also in place to address the intermediate and downstream stages. It's the intermediate stages of the process that are hardest to figure out. Because here, the capital requirements are much larger than they are in the option creation stage. In fact, as you move across these 4 stages, the capital requirements increase roughly by an order of magnitude at each stage. And they certainly go in these second and third stages well beyond what traditional venture capitalists can do. On the other hand, the risks are too great for traditional forms of project and corporate finance. We don't currently have any sustainable solutions to this problem of these intermediate stages in place. We've had recently a 2 or 3 year boost here from the stimulus spending, but that's now over, essentially. There were proposals prior to the stimulus. We had things like the Clean Energy Deployment Administration, or whatever, CEDA, whatever those letters stand for. We had ideas for green banks. We had the proposal for a federal demonstration corporation, a federal entity that would focus on demonstrating new technologies. Some of these are now resurfacing as the boost from the stimulus dies down. The thrust of these proposals, it seems to me, is good, but one has to ask whether they really go far enough, given the scale of the challenge. But let's suppose that we were to start with a clean sheet of paper. Suppose we were to build a system of institutions and incentives that could solve this problem. What would it look like? Well, it probably wouldn't look anything like the system that we now have. The first thing is that the scale of this system that we're going to design from scratch would match the scale of the innovation challenge, in contrast to what we have in place today. There would be no pinch points in financing. There would be smooth handoffs from one stage to the next, filling in the so-called valleys of death. There would be space for new entrants. Our energy industry in the United States has been dominated by relatively large, well-financed, politically influential, and risk-averse corporations with a history of underinvestment in innovation. I don't know that we need to go over this, but the amount of energy spending on innovation in the energy sector is very, very small in relation to most other reasonably technology-intensive industries. And these firms, these big firms, have often had and still do have an interest in preserving the status quo. Our system would rely, wherever possible, on competition to determine outcomes. Not necessarily market competition, but still competition between technologies, organizations, and business models. And of course, in our ideal system, the users of these technologies would have an increasingly influential voice as one moves to the right of the 4-stage model we talked about. Our system would have a timely and rigorous process of down selection at each stage so that non-competitive technologies would not continue to receive support after it had become obvious that they couldn't compete. In our ideal system, public subsidies would be designed to decline over time predictably so as to create incentives for performance improvements, and would be terminated in the absence of improvement or once the beneficiaries became competitive. Our system would accommodate and exploit differences in regional assets and regional capabilities. There are aspects of energy policy where the lack of a national policy is deeply problematic. That's true in the area of electricity transmission, for example. But when it comes to innovations in energy technologies, we should recognize that public attitudes, economic conditions, natural resource endowments, and a lot of other things vary greatly. That the Southeast, the Northwest, the Southwest, the Midwest are all very different places when it comes to innovation, and our innovation system should reflect that. And we might also add that our ideal system wouldn't depend on panic and crisis to be activated. I don't think any of these attributes would come as a surprise to anybody in this room. They're pretty obvious. But it's worth pointing out that the current system that we have in place, the current energy innovation system, doesn't really satisfy any of these requirements in any serious way. So what would? What would satisfy these attributes? Well, here is a somewhat radical approach that David Hart and I wrote about in our recent book that's centered on a network of regionally based innovation investment banks to address the intermediate stages of the innovation problem, the stages that give us today the biggest headache because we don't really know how to solve them. Now, without claiming that this is the only such approach, and certainly not the best one, I'm going to use it as an example to illustrate some of the main design principles for what the U.S. energy innovation system could become. These regional investment banks, innovation investment banks, I'm going to call them RIBs, would focus on investing again in the demonstration and early adoption of low carbon energy supply technologies, both centralized and decentralized, and might also include storage and some smart grid innovations as well as demand side innovations too. They would be investing in innovations that today are expensive or inefficient but have the potential to descend the learning curve and eventually to achieve and deliver cheap, reliable, low-carbon electricity. And by the way, the focus here is on electricity because that is really the front lines of the energy innovation problem. That is where we either will succeed or fail in electricity. The projects would be proposed by many different kinds of teams, individual firms, groups of firms, partnerships that might include established firms, entrepreneurial suppliers, power producers, labs, universities. And here you see one principle, which is to open up the energy innovation system to new players and new combinations of players. The teams that propose projects would seek funding from the RIBs not as the sole source of finance, but rather to augment their own investments and reduce their risks. The RIBs would use a range of investment instruments, loans, loan guarantees, interest buy-downs, equity infusions. And the investments by the RIBs would leverage larger amounts of private sector funding. And here, again, is another principle, which is to fill the financing gap in our demonstration and early adoption stages, where the system has been notably weak. Like venture capitalists, these RIBs would choose among competing proposals based on the strength of the team, the quality of the management, the attractiveness of the technology, the extent of self-funding, and so on. There would be several of these banks around the country to allow for differences of opinion about what's most promising and regional variations in what's most useful and acceptable. Indeed, over time, these banks might be expected to specialize in areas of technology that would be of particular interest to their region. Offshore wind here in the Northeast, nuclear in the Southeast, carbon capture in the Midwest, and so on. The banks could operate independently or they could collaborate on investment decisions, but there's another important principle here, which is that of pluralism, especially at the regional level. Unlike today, where a project needs to go to Washington, to the federal government, this time the project team would have the option of approaching more than one of these boards, or perhaps even all of them. There would be a check on the process to make sure that it doesn't become too inbred. there would be something not shown on this chart, a gatekeeper at the federal level to certify that a particular innovation that was funded by this mechanism would have the potential to lead to significant reductions in carbon emissions at a declining unit cost over time. The role of the gatekeeper would not be to determine whether a specific project should or shouldn't receive funding. That would be the job of the investment banks. But it would be responsible for recertifying or decertifying projects depending on whether they were progressing, trying to avoid the worst pathologies that we've seen even in the recent past, zombie projects that don't die. The last two pieces of this have to do with funding. How would we pay for this? Where would the funds come from? Here we propose a dedicated funding stream based on a surcharge on electricity use. To give a concrete example, a 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour charge would generate roughly $8 billion, which in turn would likely leverage 2 to 3 more times that amount in private funds. The scale of that system would be 7 or 8 times what our current federally financed system is generating. And by the way, a surcharge of 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour on your electricity bill would add $1.80 per month to the average residential bill in the United States. The banks, the RIBs, wouldn't be entitled to these surcharge funds. Rather, there would be a state-level trustee organization in each state to disperse the proceeds, and that would be free to allocate the funds to one or more of the regional banks based on its assessment of which RIB's portfolio of projects most closely matched its needs. And all of the funds would have to be allocated by the trustees within a year of receiving them, so no hoarding by the trustees. The boards would be competing for these funds on the basis of their portfolios of projects. And here, then, the last principle of competition. Here you see at 2 levels. The banks competing for funding from the state trustees and the project teams competing for funding from the regional investment banks. So to briefly restate the principles here, this would be an energy innovation system, or at least a piece of an energy innovation system, that is bigger, more comprehensive across the innovation life cycle, including those intermediate stages, more pluralistic in the sense that you could go to a different place if you weren't able to persuade one investor, that would be more open to new entrants, that would be more competitive, that would be more capable of weeding out failures, although not seeking to avoid failure, and that would be more accommodating of regional variations. This is relative to the system we have now, which relies on congressional appropriation of DOE, particularly of DOE administered funds. Now, this is not the only scheme by any means that would satisfy the principles I've just mentioned. It almost certainly is not the best one. Indeed, there are many possible variants even of this scheme. Instead of having a federally mandated innovation surcharge on electricity, you might actually see such a system growing organically. First, in some parts of the country where there's a strong commitment to innovation and cross-state collaboration, and then in others. And we're seeing things in New York and other parts of the country, California, where you start, in fact, we're starting to see something emerging not totally different from what I'm describing here. But the main point is that there's plenty of room for new ideas. And our hope in proposing this scheme is that others will be stimulated to come up with different and better ones. Because to make this energy transition to a low-carbon system, we're going to have to be as creative about the institutional design of the innovation system as we're going to have to be about the innovations themselves. So let me stop there have maybe a few minutes of questions, if anybody has any, and then we'll move to a shorter, I promise it'll be shorter, discussion of where nuclear is heading. Okay, so does anyone, yes sir?
Vasily Zanis is my name, from Boston University. It seems that funds will be somehow attracted and then competitively will be distributed to the project. Who is going to make the decision which projects are going to be selected? So you need a panel of reviewers and experts, impartialities and so on and so forth. So you need another layer there to make sure that the funds are correctly distributed.
So
it's
in
like
this
the NIH funding, it's like funding any type of research. You have a funding organization, proposals, evaluators, and
so in this scheme, that role would be played by these regional innovation investment banks. They would be the ones deciding on the disbursement of funds to individual projects. They themselves would have to compete for their funds from the states that would be collecting the revenues from the innovation surcharge. So, but the decisions on which projects to finance would be made by investment professionals employed by these regional investment banks.
But are they going to be economists or scientists?
No.
Combination?
It would be unlikely because these, remember, this is a scheme that is directed not to the front end of the energy innovation system, not to fundamental research, not to the creation of new options, but rather to large-scale commercial demonstration projects and early adoption projects, where the criteria for choosing projects are very different from the criteria that we employ, that the NIH employs for fundamental research in life sciences, that the DOE employs for fundamental research in energy. At this stage, this key stage, the kind of expertise that is needed is not so much peer review of scientific invention, but business knowledge, knowledge of markets, knowledge of what users need or looking for. That's the kind of investment that will be made.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So Doug,
why don't we take one to the back?
so there's two at the back, three actually. Let's, this gentleman on the back row was the first with his hand up.
Hello, my name is Brian Belize. I'm a student here at Northeastern University. My question revolves around the fact that I don't see much in the line of environmental controls in here. Is this modeling purely based on the investors wanting to see a good ROI? In which case it seems like that's already the system we're working in.
Right.
We're geared towards financial investment, the return, and that's what people are looking at, not how can we solve the climate crisis.
So it's an excellent question, and what's not shown on this chart, but which is a key part of this particular scheme, is that projects that would be eligible for funding from these regional banks, and ultimately from the surcharge on electricity, the projects that would be eligible would be certified by a federal, I use the term gatekeeper, that would not judge the business potential, not the ROI potential, but would judge the technology on which the projects were based on the basis of the potential contribution to carbon emission reduction. So in order to get into this game, you would have to be certified that your project does have the potential to contribute to carbon emission reductions in one way or another. And if you were not showing significant progress over a period of time, you would be decertified by that same gatekeeper, and you would be out of the running for future investment. So the social dimension, if you like, or the environmental dimension of the innovation process would be, in a sense, determined by the certification and decertification process. But once you were certified, you would have to show, you would have to satisfy the investment criteria of these investment banks or innovation banks would apply. So I don't want to agree with you that ROI doesn't matter, but your question is an excellent one, because it reminds me to emphasize that in order to get into this, you would have to be certified, your project, your technology would have to be certified that it would contribute to our carbon emissions, to solving our carbon emissions problem.
And just to follow up to that,
Yeah.
would you, I mean, metrics wise, to measure the effect, you think like megawatts or?
I think it's how this gatekeeper would apply its broad criteria is a very important question. I don't claim that we have the answers, but they certainly would have to apply measures to show, metrics to show progress. And if no progress or insufficient progress, they would have to be decertified. But I mean, it's a role that one could imagine a gatekeeper organization playing. It's a role that gets much harder to play if that gatekeeper is also making investment decisions. So there is underlying this is the idea that those two things should be separated.
Thank you.
I think there was a question way at the back.
I'm Will Walker. I'm a student here at Northeastern in the PhD program in Law and Public Policy. And I sort of have the other half of that question. Is sort of, I can see what's in it in this system for the guys presenting projects P1 through P7. They stand to get funding, get their project going. A lot of them probably have a financial stake in the success of the project. I can understand the trustee organizations are presumably going to have a fiduciary duty to disperse the funds in the way that best accomplishes the objectives of the trust. What I don't understand is, let's say I'm a regional investment bank here, and I'm Region 3, I'm betting on P5 and P6, those look like good projects to me. Let's say those projects do well, what do I win? What's my incentive here? What drives? Because when you talk about competition, it all boils down to what do I win?
And what you would at least potentially win would be the next round of allocations by the state trustees. I mean, a state trustee would not be as inclined to invest in a failed regional investment bank whose performance is demonstrably weak. Now, there are a number of objections that could be raised and have been raised to this. So, for example, one is that why would a state trustee ever consider investing outside its own state, or at least outside the region within which the state is located? And so is it plausible that a state trustee would ever allocate funds, let's say an Oregon state trustee would ever allocate funds to a Southeast regional investment bank? And that's a fair concern, and certainly some people in the states that we've discussed this with say that would be hard to do. But there is, of course, a very good and important example of situations where state trustees do this all the time. State pension fund trustees are, of course, always investing in instruments that have nothing to do with the state in which that's making the investment. So it's not in any sense unthinkable that state trustees would be inclined to invest in non-local regional investment banks if it was felt that they were able to advance the goal of carbon emission reductions more effectively than anyone else, if that portfolio was more attractive than anyone else. So I think my answer to your question may not be fully persuasive to you, but my answer to your question is, What would motivate the regional investment banks would be the opportunity to stay in business next year by convincing the trustees in these states that they are actually making a contribution to solving this national and global problem. And if they're not, then they don't get funded next year. Doug, and this perhaps could be the last question, and then I'll move on to the nuclear piece.
Richard, your 7% improvement annually is a stunningly challenging number. Do we have any examples that come immediately to mind, maybe Moore's Law is the best, of where we've achieved that kind of pace of innovation over an extended period of time that we can use to sort of model, tell people this is not impossible, one, that it's not impossible, two, we've done it before in other fields, not energy?
So the Moore's Law example is, I think, it's a good one, although it doesn't, of course, quite translate into what we're talking about here. The Moore's Law example applies to a particular type of technology which achieved probably something like 7% per year improvements over a period of many decades, maybe even more rapid than that. What we're talking about here is not a single technological advance. We're talking about many, many individual innovations and many, many contributions to the overall, because these are aggregate numbers, obviously, aggregated over the entire economy. And I think it would be hard to find precedent for this. There have certainly been times in the past when our economy has grown very, very rapidly. Of course, that's not a very good analog either for what we're talking about. But, you know, it is a stunning number, but if we look at it and say it's impossible and then don't do anything, then I think that would be a very unfortunate response.
Well, just to follow up, no, I agree completely. And actually the reason I was looking for an analog was for people, to give people hope that the number is not so beyond reach that you really can't achieve it. It'd be interesting to look through history,
I mean,
the industrial revolution, sort of the changes that have happened over many decades.
There are periods, short periods, where we probably have approached it. Indeed, I haven't looked at the specific ratios here, but there are related ratios that suggest that we've done something close to this on carbon emissions over the last 3 or 4 years. But there were two reasons for that, two dominant reasons for that. One was, of course, the economy was in the tank, and the other was that we had a very dramatic shift from coal to natural gas and electric power generation that isn't sustainable. So I think we could point to limited periods of time where we've achieved something like this. I don't think we could find, although it's a question, we should look harder. It's unlikely, though, that I think we're going to find long periods of time where we've achieved anything quite like this. Okay, if you will then permit me, I want to move to the nuclear issue. And I'll try and be quick